So, Prof, in June 2021, the government also issued guidelines that are to be followed when an employee refuses to be vaccinated. And here's a few of them. Employees must be informed of the right to refuse vaccination, but this is based on constitutional and medical grounds. The constitutional grounds are the right to bodily integrity and the right to freedom of religion, belief, and opinion, and this is in Section 13 of the law. That the employer must also take reasonable steps to accommodate that employee. Now, are these guideline legislation and are they binding in any way?
Well, they're binding in the sense that if an employer imposes a vaccine mandate and fails to follow all the steps, fails to reasonably accommodate an employee, for example, if that is possible, then it is likely that this will be an unfair labor practice and that there wouldn't be any consequences for the employee. But it's in that sense, it is, I guess, binding, but yeah.
In all of these guidelines, nothing says, speaks about the dismissal of an employee. And with that being said, then, is that the right way to look at it?
Well, the guidelines make very clear that if you're going to dismiss an employee for not getting vaccinated, it will have to be a last resort. So you have to counsel. You have to try and accommodate the employee, for example, if it's possible to put them in the broom cupboard far away from other people or to work from home. You have to go through those steps. Then, if that's not possible, in terms of the labor law, the person is not capable of doing the job, and then a termination can occur, as the CCMA has now confirmed in at least one instance.
So we've actually had two cases, right?
Yeah.
And these employees were dismissed in favor of the employers. The rulings, obviously were attached. Now, can these stand up in a court of law, though?
Well, the CCMA do not make binding findings that create legal precedent. So, and it's not a court of law. The CCMA is to resolve disputes in the workplace.
Well, they're commissioners, right?
Yes. So it is giving us guidance and giving guidance to employees and employers how fair labor practices work as regards to vaccines and vaccine mandates.
Yes.
But it is not binding on a court. It can be reviewed, the CCMA decision, and it can be overturned by the labor court. And of course, these have nothing to do with a constitutional challenge to the regulations or to any rules to impose a vaccine mandate. That is a very different question.
So it's very clear. CCMA rulings cannot make legal precedents. Okay. Now, when a person is forced to take mandatory vaccinations, which of their constitutional rights are being trampled upon?
Well, there is some dispute about which rights are being trampled upon. One would be, some people argue, the right to bodily integrity and especially your right to choose about what you put in your body and how you deal with your body. The other right is a right to freedom of religion and conscience, because the argument is that some people, for religious reasons, might believe that the vaccine is the mark of the devil or whatever. The problem with the first issue is that the vaccine mandate does not actually directly force you to get a vaccine. So the limitation is indirect in a way. So, but one can say that there is a limitation, yes.
So then in that way, an employer can or cannot demand mandatory vaccinations?
Well, it depends on a lot of factors. If the regulations and the guidelines provide for mandatory vaccination, until those guidelines and regulations are constitutionally challenged and invalidated, the employer can impose a vaccine mandate because the employer is empowered to do so as long as they follow the guidelines. But a different question is whether these regulations or any other legislation that might provide for, permit, or mandate vaccination, whether that will be constitutionally compliant, and then you have to balance the interest of the individual and their rights against the interest that is being pursued by having everybody vaccinated. So you balance different interests. My individual personal interest versus the interest and the safety and the health of the entire society. Yeah.
That, because you see, that's where the conundrum is, right? Because what are the principles around that, Prof? You know, how do we, you know, because as an individual, I'm saying I vaccinated myself. I also took a risk, right, by vaccinating myself, mark of the beast, whatever, tagged 5G or whatever. The same way that you're taking a risk by saying that you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
But there's consequences on both sides.
Yes.
So what do those principles say around that?
So it's all about proportionality. So the more important the purpose of the vaccination is, saving lives, reducing spread, and whatever, the more likely it is that the court will say it's proportionate to actually impose a vaccine mandate. The more drastic and severe the limitation of a person's rights is, the more likely the court will say, well, maybe it is not proportionate to impose a mandate if your rights are going to be really extinguished or limited in a radical way. With vaccines, the big unknown is that with Omicron, the vaccine is less effective at stopping the spread of COVID. It's still very effective at saving lives and reducing people who go to the hospital, but the question now is it proportionate to impose a vaccine mandate to save lives and to protect everybody if the effectiveness of the vaccine in stopping or reducing spread is there, but it is not as great as it used to be before this variant came into effect. We don't know what the courts will say on that.
So do you then think an employer is acting correct when dismissing an employee for being refused to vaccinate?
Well, I think and I agree with the guidelines that dismissal always is a last resort. You always have to try and accommodate the employee. But in a context where the employee is going to, by not vaccinating, making it impossible for them to do their job properly, or for the company to function properly, dismissal, as in any other context where it becomes impossible for an employee to do their job, becomes, as a last resort, justifiable.
You mentioned something quite interesting earlier on, and it seems there's a lot of differences, you know, in interpreting the constitutional rights of individuals versus society. Would you then say these matters, these are destined for the constitutional court, right? A huge conundrum for any judge.
Yes. So it will be surprising if one of these cases do not get all the way to the constitutional court. The important thing that people who think about this must remember, though, is that the court will weigh up the interest, but they will rely on the verifiable medical evidence. They will not rely on Facebook posts that has nothing to do with the actual medical evidence. So, you know, the difficulty with this the debate is that not everybody accepts the medical evidence, either about effectiveness of protecting people from serious illness or death or transmission. But the courts go with the medical consensus. They don't go with
public opinion.
Yeah, they don't go with public opinion or with those who question the medical evidence, because that's not how courts work. The court work with the facts that they have before them as verified.
Yeah. Are there other things that we may need to consider when looking at this case? You know, because yes, obviously there's the medical evidence, there's the individual rights, there's the rights of society. Is there something else that we're forgetting here when looking at the context of South Africa and how our country is?
Well, there are two things that are very important. The first one is that any kind of vaccine mandate can only be justified if everybody, in fact, practically have access to the vaccine and is not going to be disadvantaged, or it's not going to be more difficult for them to access vaccine because they are poor or because of their race or their gender or whatever. So that's important. In the workplace, it's easy because there you can make sure everybody has access to the vaccine in an equitable way. Broader society, I'm not sure, given the way the vaccines work, that is always true. Because you have to register on the internet or there are all these barriers. The second question, which I'm not a public health specialist, so I don't really know myself what the answer is, but the second question is, what is the best way to actually get everybody or as many people as possible vaccinated to protect themselves and to protect others? Is the mandate the best way to do that? Should the mandate be used in some context with other measures? That's the question. Because the goal is not to punish anybody or to impose some kind of draconian system. It is to make sure that everybody is protected as best they can by the vaccines that are available. So that is a huge question, especially in a country like South Africa. Now in so many other countries as well, where there's huge distrust and trust issues against experts, against governments, and so on. So it's a hard question to really know how to answer.
So, Prof, when you look at the constitutional grounds, and this is around the issue of the right to bodily integrity and the right to freedom of religion, belief, and opinion in Section 13, which is one of the cases that was brought before the CCMA. The person was very religious, and this is the section that he chose to use as law.
Yes, the problem with the argument about religious exemption is you cannot say I'm religious and I'm against the vaccine because I don't think it works or it's dangerous and therefore I have a religious exemption, because your opposition to the vaccine is not directly linked to your religious beliefs. If you're Catholic, the Catholic Church do not say that it is religiously unacceptable, for example, to take a vaccine. So if you can show that your sincerely held religious beliefs really includes that all vaccines are unacceptable, you shouldn't put anything foreign in your body, you will be entitled to the exemption. If you just say, I'm religious and I'm also opposed to the vaccine because I don't believe the science, that is not a religious exemption. It's a religious person wanting an exemption for other reasons.
Very interesting. So when we look at the guidelines that were issued in 2021, that was during the Delta variant. Obviously, we've now moved on to Omicron. Does that mean they need to then update those guidelines? Because this one has, it's a different variant.
The problem with COVID generally is that everything moves so fast and it changes, and the evidence change, the facts change. So a good management means of this whole system means that yes, it is required to revise and update policies. How depends, of course, on exactly what the medical evidence now say and how it is assessed by those who make the policy.